Generally speaking, Western cinema of the 1970s was obsessed with gritty realism, with down-to-earth blue-collar characters and gloomy undercurrents of pessimism, cynicism, and disillusionment. Science fiction film was only different in so much as things were still given a sheen of futurism, a shine and polish that tended to undercut the more dour characters and dystopian themes. Then came Star Wars, a throwback to pulpy sci-fi serials of the 30s and 40s that ditched the navel-gazing in favor of old-fashioned entertainment, of the triumph of good over evil. Sci-fi became fun again, and Hollywood movie studios went into an instant arms race to find the next Star Wars, to give audiences what they seemed to crave in the form of swashbuckling adventure, blaster fire, shiny robots, and laser swords. However, the very same studio that had hit such a goldmine in George Lucas's Fantastic Joyride, 20th Century Fox, found itself working on a space story of a very different type, something that would take the genre in nearly the opposite direction, into the dreary depths of psychological dread and visceral terror. What Star Wars had done for the fantasy side of science fiction, this movie was going to do for the other side.
The crew of the commercial towing vessel Nostromo is awoken from hypersleep only to discover that they are still thousands of light years from home.
That's not our system.
I know that.
Tasked with exploring an unknown distress call from a nearby system, they land on the surface of LV-426, where a derelict alien spacecraft lies in wait. When one of the members of the exploration team is attacked by a mysterious life form, he is brought back to the Nostromo, where he gives birth to a terrible monster that threatens the lives of the entire crew.
Before we go any further, I just want to thank everybody for getting me to 5,000 subscribers. I am thrilled that you have found my videos worth your time, and here's hoping for 5,000 more in the very near future. To show my appreciation, I have prepared this bonus-sized video on one of the most important and influential science fiction films of all time, so please, enjoy. Oh, and please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I wouldn't have gotten this far if I didn't ask. With that out of the way, let's get back to the subject at hand. Much to the disapproval of his parents, St. Louis native Dan O'Bannon was raised on a steady diet of pulp sci-fi and horror magazines like Weird Science, Weird Fantasy, and If Magazine, alongside books like Philip Jose Farmer's Strange Relations and the collected works of H.P. Lovecraft. An art student, comic, and aspiring filmmaker, O'Bannon received a bachelor's degree from the University of Southern California Film School in 1970, where he met and collaborated with John Carpenter on the film Dark Star. He and Carpenter had a falling out shortly thereafter, but O'Bannon was invited to Paris to work with Alejandro Jodorowsky on his ambitious adaptation of Dune, along with the likes of British illustrator Chris Foss, famed French artist Jean Mobius Giraud, and the Swiss surrealist H.R. Giger. When that project fell apart in epic fashion, O'Bannon was forced to move back to the States, settling in Hollywood without much money, a job, or any prospects on the horizon. He moved in with his friend Ronald Shusett, who had been impressed enough with Dark Star to enlist his help on what would eventually become Total Recall. O'Bannon was also eager to work on his own script, an unfinished 29-page work called Memory. Building off of the goofy alien plot in Dark Star, Memory was a more horror-focused take on the idea of a crew of spacefarers being menaced by a creature from outer space. Dozens of different properties have been named as primary inspiration for O'Bannon's work, including films like It, The Terror from Beyond Space, Planet of the Vampires, Forbidden Planet, The Thing from Another World, and Queen of Blood, all of which have more than their fair share of similarities. However, in O'Bannon's own words, he claims he didn't steal from anybody. He stole from everybody. He and Shusett worked together to turn Memory into a full script, with Shusett, probably inspired by his coming fatherhood and by O'Bannon's persistent digestive issues, offering the idea to have the alien implant one of the crew members with an embryo that would violently erupt from his or her torso, similar to how certain species of parasitic wasp reproduce. This script went through multiple names, most famously Starbeast, before O'Bannon and Shusett finally agreed on Alien. Using the same kind of production design book that Jodorowsky had used for Dune, the duo shopped their script around to various studios with little success. Perhaps the only man who loved it was the prolific B-movie pioneer Roger Corman, who was willing to make the film, but hesitant because he felt the script deserved a bigger budget than he could provide. Corman told O'Bannon and Shusett to approach Brandywine Productions, a relatively small outfit founded in 1969 by Walter Hill, David Giler, and Gordon Carroll, that didn't have any real films to its name, but did have a first-look deal with 20th Century Fox. Hill and Giler liked the idea of the project, but insisted on numerous rewrites to clean up the script and add the subplot involving the android Ash. O'Bannon hated the idea of Ash, believing the addition to be a pointless subplot akin to the Russian spy of Fantastic Voyage, a cheap distraction that adds inorganic tension and doesn't genuinely relate to the main conflict. Thankfully, he was overruled. Even with Hill and Giler's revisions, though, Fox wasn't terribly interested, and the script collected dust in the hands of Fox head Alan Ladd Jr. Then Star Wars happened, and suddenly Ladd was eager to find the next space adventure to produce. Alien was subsequently greenlit for a modest $4.6 million budget.
Walk in the park!
And the search for a director was expedited. Though O'Bannon wanted to direct it himself, and Hill was attached as a director for a while, several other directors were considered, including Peter Yates, Jack Clayton, Robert Aldrich, and even Steven Spielberg. But the heads of Brandywine chose to instead approach Ridley Scott, an up-and-comer who had just released his first film, The Duelists. Scott came from an art background and had worked in commercials and advertising, specializing in design and cinematography. Though he wasn't particularly interested in making a science fiction film, he had been heavily influenced by the genre, specifically Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Scott was enthralled by the script and eagerly signed on, quickly drawing up designs and a full storyboard from his home in London, which was impressive enough to convince Fox to up the budget to $8.6 million and make the film at Shepperton Studios in Britain. O'Bannon, who had tried and failed to convince the studio heads to hire H.R. Giger for the alien designs, then showed Giger's Necronomicon to Ridley Scott. Scott loved Giger's work and got him on board, knowing that Giger had a keen sense of the kind of disturbing, sexually charged, and unique alien he was looking for. O'Bannon also brought in as designers Chris Foss and Jean Giraud, who had worked with him and Giger on Jodorowsky's Dune, along with Ron Cobb, who had not only worked on Dark Star, but had also helped create the Alien production booklet. With so many artistically trained people working on Alien, there was no conceivable way it wouldn't be visually interesting, at the very least. Ridley Scott was determined to get an exceptional cast, since there were only 7 characters in the entire film, not counting Mother and the eponymous creature. The script was deliberately written with vague characters that weren't tied to any specific gender, giving the director plenty of leeway to cast them as he saw fit. Scott is normally meticulous about casting, and the fact that it took him right up to the start of production to decide on his final cast made the studio heads incredibly nervous. With casting calls underway in both London and the United States under 2 different casting directors, one of the first actors approached was Tom Skerritt, who had previously rejected the part of Captain Dallas when the film's budget had been much smaller. After Harrison Ford declined the part, Skerritt was asked again, and after he was told about the increased budget and the new director, he agreed. For the critical role of Kane, John Hurt was considered before a scheduling conflict forced him to bow out and be replaced by John Finch. However, Finch, on his first day of shooting, became very ill as a complication of undiagnosed diabetes. In an odd stroke of luck, John Hurt's schedule cleared up after the South African government mistook him for the politically active John Hurd and denied him access to the country, where he was supposed to work on another film. And so Hurt came aboard Alien just after Finch had gone to the hospital. Veronica Cartwright auditioned for the role of Ripley, but found out during costume fittings that she would instead be playing Lambert, a character that went through significant changes during this time. As for Ripley, Scott considered a young Meryl Streep, but after meeting Sigourney Weaver, who ironically wanted the role of Lambert, he knew he'd found his lead actress. The producers insisted on giving her a few screen tests, which Scott dutifully did, and when they were shown to female crew members, Weaver was compared favorably to several great actresses, giving Scott all the evidence he needed that he had picked the right woman for the job. Weaver was probably the least experienced actor on set, and Scott used this insecurity and desire to prove herself as hallmarks for her performance, even encouraging her fellow castmates to push her buttons so that she would be suitably frustrated as the film went on. Character actor Harry Dean Stanton plays Brett, and when Stanton went into audition, he informed Scott ahead of time that he didn't like science fiction or monster movies. Scott cast him anyway, convincing the actor that the film would be more of a thriller, in his words, like 10 Little Indians in the Old Dark House.
Right.
Whenever he says anything, you say right, Brett. You know that?
Right.
Alongside him in the role of Parker is Yaphet Kotto, probably best known at the time for his villainous role in Live and Let Die. Kotto was so convinced that the movie would be a massive hit that he turned down a higher-paying role in another film. The android Ash is played by Ian Holm, who was already a well-regarded Shakespearean actor with a Tony Award to his name, though Alien would be his first feature film credit. Ridley Scott was taken with Ash's idiosyncratic quirks and twitches and encouraged the actor to play around with them. As such, many of Ash's most unusual moments, like this sudden jog, were Ian Holm's ideas. As for the alien itself, Scott initially considered using puppetry, animatronics, and even stop motion, determined not to give the audience another man in a suit. Back when Robert Aldrich had been attached as director, he had suggested using a shaved orangutan, which was one of the reasons the producers ultimately decided to find a different director. Scott reluctantly agreed to try an unusually tall actor, even considering Chewbacca himself, Peter Mayhew, and found a young graphics design student named Balaji Badejo, who stood at a whopping 6 foot 10 inches. Badejo was given Tai Chi and mime classes to help with his movements, and was forbidden by Scott to dine with the rest of the crew to prevent them getting used to him. Lastly, Phase 4's Helen Horton lends her voice to the Nostromo's onboard computer, Mother.
The option to override automatic detonation expires in T-minus 5 minutes.
Filming began in July of 1978 on a tight schedule of only 13 weeks, because Fox was eager to capitalize on the post-Star Wars sci-fi boom. However, due to rewrites and changes throughout production, Scott managed to get an extension of another month, partly to film the fourth act sequence with Ripley and the alien aboard the escape shuttle, which wasn't part of the script. Building off of an early idea of O'Bannon's to have the adult alien become intelligent, Scott's initial vision had the alien bite Ripley's head off and then deliver the final log entry in her voice. But thankfully, he abandoned this idea when others told him how awful it was. Ridley Scott insisted on doing most of the camera work himself, and he was a perfectionist when it came to things like lighting and atmosphere. In order to achieve diffuse light, he would often fill a soundstage with copious amounts of smoke and have people waving makeshift fans and slabs of cardboard, one of which accidentally appears in the final film, until the entire set was filled with a uniform layer of thickness. He would then set up dozens of small pin lights in strategic locations that would never be directly seen by the camera, with the exception of this shot of LV-426's sun, which is actually a light pointed directly into the camera lens. Most of the sets were designed to be reused, including the space jockey chamber, which doubles as the place where Kane finds the alien eggs. The space jockey itself was a 26-foot-tall model designed and painted by H.R. Giger that was movable, and it was made to appear even larger by having children, namely Ridley Scott's own kids, in the spacesuits. This trick was also used for several of the long shots of the 3 crew members throughout their trek on the planet's surface. It's worth noting that the producers wanted to axe the entire space jockey sequence, thinking it was pointless, but Scott and his team fought hard to keep it in the film. Unfortunately, while the alien egg prop was placed in the Smithsonian in 2003, the space jockey sculpture was torched in 1979 by vandals who were convinced it was the work of Satan. As for the corridor sets, they were being frequently painted over in different colors, with Scott himself carrying around spray cans to touch them up during filming. While some of the walls were also sprayed with water to mimic condensation, more often than not, the wet appearance is a result of paint that hadn't dried by the time cameras were rolling. To give the Nostromo sets an industrial, lived-in feel, they were built out of spare airplane parts, milk crates, and other random bits of junk that the crew salvaged from an aviation graveyard, most notably a pair of bombers. A lot of that can be seen in this set, which was peppered with gold-painted foil to visually suggest NASA satellites and other spacecraft. You can also see on this set some old mining equipment and a broken-down helicopter. Ridley Scott was impressed with how Star Wars had managed to dirty up some of the technology, and he wanted to take it a step further in his own film. He wanted Alien to be ultra gritty, to highlight the story of what the producers called truckers in space. He wanted the Nostromo to be a patchwork assemblage of rundown systems that barely worked, filled with evidence of people having lived there for long stretches. In the living spaces, he put in lots of bits and bobs that, in his mind, must have come from various gift shops and gas stations around the galaxy. He also wanted it to literally have a life of its own, as evidenced in the long establishing shots that open the film, where the Nostromo can be seen moving around and waking up before it revives the crew from hypersleep. One thing that became problematic were the large jets of CO2 used in several scenes, especially during the self-destruct sequence. Scott loved their utility and visual appearance, but they very quickly made it difficult for the actors to breathe, requiring a lot of short takes and breaks in which to air out the sets. Despite the dirty, broken-down look, Scott still took a lot of inspiration from the more clean-cut 2001, particularly its slow, operatic approach to space travel. This is most apparent in this sequence, but 2001 inspired various aspects of the film in more subtle ways, like this repurposing of 2001's best gag. Still, Scott wasn't too beholden to actual realism, concerning himself more with visceral impression than with logical cohesion. For example, he wanted to use a lot of common horror atmospherics like lightning and rain, even while producers scratched their heads trying to figure out how those could exist in space. When pressed, Scott's explanation was that if the audience is invested in the tone, which he so carefully spends the first 40 minutes of the film setting up, then viewers will create their own rationalizations if need be, or simply accept the illogic of it because it feels viscerally real in the universe of the story. And speaking of viscera, there was quite a bit of it used throughout the film, from the lace fat over cow innards of the facehugger and its egg, to the oysters and other bits of sea creatures used for its undercarriage after its death. Sheep brains stood in for human brains a couple of times, and the famous Chestburster Scene used all kinds of offal that, under the hot stage lights and over the extensive prep time for the scene, apparently smelled revolting, to the point that cast and crew had to struggle to avoid throwing up. There's a lot of Hollywood legend around that scene, but the actors knew, broadly speaking, what was going to happen, and it wasn't exactly done in one take. All the cast but John Hurt were kept away from the set during prep, but they knew something was supposed to emerge from Kane's prosthetic chest, spray blood on them, and then dart away along a track on the table. There is some genuine shock on their faces, especially Cartwright's, who just happened to be standing in the right place to get sprayed in the face by a huge jet of raspberry juice standing in for blood. She even fell over when it happened. It did take multiple attempts to get the chestburster to break through Kane's shirt, however, and though this was no doubt frustrating, at least one of the failed attempts made it into the final film. The music was composed by one of science fiction's greatest, Jerry Goldsmith. However, his initial score was turned down by Scott, who thought Goldsmith had been a bit too florid and bombastic. When Goldsmith tried again, Scott was much happier, though there were several music cues that were replaced in the final edit, some by other work Goldsmith had done for the film Freud, and the finale and credits music by Howard Hanson's Symphony No. 2. Goldsmith was displeased, to put it lightly, though he and Scott would later reconcile, and Goldsmith would forgive him for being a young director that hadn't yet learned how to properly convey what he wanted from his composer. The pair would even work together again on 1985's Legend, though for reasons of studio politics out of Scott's hands, Goldsmith's work on that film was replaced wholesale. Regardless of all this drama, the soundtrack for Alien is remarkable, managing to bear quite a bit of the burden of carrying the film through long stretches of slow tension building, often without dialogue. The film is also carried by the sound effects by Jim Shields, with Scott insisting they be constant throughout the film. Even though it is often so quiet as to be borderline subliminal, perhaps unconsciously recalling what it sounds like in the womb, the Nostromo is always making some kind of noise, from the constant hum of engines to the popping of heating vents, the creaking of metal, the quiet hissing of air conditioning, the trilling of computers, and the distant echoes of clanging equipment. He also wanted them to be punctuated by several bursts of incredibly loud sounds, like the jarring wind of LV-426, the blast of CO2 vents, or the mechanical screeches of engine repairs. For Scott, everything was in service to keeping the audience in a perpetual state of unease. He used a lot of off-kilter framing, unconventional editing during seemingly normal scenes, overlapping dialogue, and more. Even the occasional bits where the focus isn't quite right help in this regard, though Scott admits this wasn't a deliberate choice, merely a happy side effect of time limitations, the use of anamorphic lenses, and a lack of modern video assist. The film does have a lot of what we now derisively call jump scares, including at least 2 involving a cat, but Scott handles them well and uses them in a way that rarely feels cheap. He never lets them deflate the tension, nor do they fail to service the plot. He is careful to keep the tension high and organic, even when very little seems to be happening on screen. By the time the film was finally completed, the studio was incredibly nervous, particularly by the fact that nothing seems to happen for nearly the first half of the movie. Still, Scott stuck to his guns and refused to back down, maintaining enough control that nothing he wanted was taken out of the film, even though his first cut was over 3 hours long. Even when given the chance to make a so-called director's cut in 2003, Scott made very few meaningful changes and admits that he still prefers the theatrical version, that the newer cut is more for the fans than it is for him. The biggest change was the inclusion of a scene where Ripley encounters Dallas and Brett strung up by the alien in the belly of the Nostromo, being slowly mutated into eggs, but Scott still believes that the pacing of the climax works better without that scene's inclusion. Back in 1979, however, the film had a pair of test screenings. The first didn't go well, which was largely blamed on sound problems, but the second was met with enthusiastic praise by the test audience. Fox wasn't sure how to market it, and opted for an unconventional approach, using trailers and TV spots that didn't show any footage from the actual film, merely an early screen test of an alien egg hatching over Goldsmith's score and the now famous tagline, "In space, no one can hear you scream." After the film released on May 25th, 2 years to the day after the release of the first Star Wars, it was met with mixed reviews from critics, but a Memorial Day weekend that set several box office records. The film ultimately achieved a domestic gross of $78.9 million in its initial run, along with a sizable profit overseas, and it was widely seen as an enormous hit. Despite this, Fox, probably resorting to some egregious creative accounting tricks, tried to claim that the film somehow underperformed and cost the studio $2 million. The studio even tried to get out of funding its eventual sequel on the bizarre theory that Alien hadn't been successful enough to warrant it. Though after a few lawsuits, Fox eventually had to own up to its misbehavior and agreed to pay Brandywine to make the sequel. In addition to multiple sequels, a pair of prequels, and a very cheesy spin-off franchise, it's hard to overstate the cultural impact of the original Alien. You don't really need me to tell you, but the movie, practically overnight, forced its way into the zeitgeist, with the titular alien becoming a horror icon equal to some of the great Hollywood classics like Frankenstein and Dracula. It inspired decades of homages, parodies, and copycat films, both in science fiction and in horror.
Oh no, not again!
And it helped lay the groundwork for the slasher boom of the 1980s, which is fitting, given that one of Scott's primary influences for Alien, right next to 2001, was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the film most often credited with popularizing the whole slasher subgenre in the first place. Alien found its way into comics, video games, books, and more, and is still a revered property to this day. As of this writing, a new film is currently in the works from director Fede Alvarez, with Ridley Scott serving as producer. The reason for its enormous cultural impact, aside from it being just an incredibly well-made film, lies in how well it taps into human psychology and the things that truly terrify us. Indeed, Scott prefers to call it a terror film instead of a horror film, because it pulls something out of our collective unconscious that inspires both excitement and terror. Thematically, there's a lot to chew on, starting with the psychosexual rape analogies. The facehugger essentially rapes Kane. The adult alien with its phallic head is adept at penetrating its victims with its extendable mouth within a mouth, and even the android Ash acts with sexual overtones when he tries to kill Ripley by shoving a pornographic magazine down her throat. For a script that started life with characters of interchangeable gender and a story that doesn't feature any actual sex between the human characters, because Scott ultimately cut out references to sex among the crew, Alien manages to have deep sexual subtext. I'm not just referring to the act of sex either. There's plenty of casual misogyny, especially in how many of the male characters treat Ripley throughout the film, disregarding her advice and disrespecting her authority. For example, when Dallas, Kane, and Lambert return from the alien craft with the facehugger attached to Kane's face, Ripley wisely tries to follow quarantine protocol, telling them in as calm and rational a voice as she can what the situation is as she sees it, while Dallas shouts at her to disregard all that. Ash then overrides Ripley and lets them in anyway, out of a desire to follow his secret orders regarding the alien rather than out of spite, but Ripley reacts the way any woman in her position would react. The only crewmate who even considers siding with her afterwards is Parker, but he's not exactly a shining example of a feminine ally elsewhere in the film. It's no wonder Sigourney Weaver quickly became recognized as perhaps the first true female action star, a feminist icon for the 1980s. She never let this impression control her career. In fact, I can think of several films where she seems to be fighting against type, but she did embrace it, especially in subsequent films of the series. That's not all there is to Alien, though, not even close. The subplot involving Ash secretly protecting shady company interests, despite O'Bannon hating its inclusion, adds a different dimension of dehumanization to the mix. The other crew members are explicitly expendable, caught between the purity of nature, represented by the alien, and the cold, unfeeling bottom line, represented by Ash. Scott would return to this theme again and in more depth with Blade Runner, but here it's elegantly simple. There's also a bit of classism going on, with even this blue-collar group of truckers in space segregating themselves into a strict pecking order with the hardest workers placed at the bottom. There's also a fascinating juxtaposition between the organic and synthetic. As mentioned before, Scott wanted the Nostromo itself to feel like a living thing, and the film opens with it metaphorically giving birth to its crew, starting fittingly enough with Kane. They even call the ship's computer Mother. That's not a coincidence. Then we see the alien ship, with its heavy Giger designs that are far more biological than mechanical. The hallways look like twisted rib cages, and the space jockey looks like it's been fused with its chair. The alien itself acts out of instinct and survival, unclouded by delusions of morality, as Ash puts it in a speech that was scripted on the fly. This then gets at a primal conflict within the human condition, the struggle between our base instincts and our intellectual pursuits, of our capacity for creation offset by our capacity for destruction, a struggle that Scott would put at the forefront in his last Alien film, the underappreciated alien covenant. As for me, I guess it goes without saying that I absolutely love Alien. It's one of the greatest films ever made, full stop, and it probably competes with John Carpenter's The Thing as my favorite sci-fi horror. Yes, it is a very slow burn, lacking the action and thrills of its sequels, but what it lacks in momentum, it more than makes up for in atmosphere and genuine terror. Do I even need to say it? The original Alien is, incontrovertibly, a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Let me know what you think of Alien in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you'd like to support what I do even more, consider becoming a patron to gain access to bonus content, vote on future topics, and more. Also be sure to check out my podcasts, The Streaming Heap and From Here to Paternity, available wherever you get your podcasts, and my debut novel Paradox, available through Amazon. You can find links in the description and also on my website at emcgill.com, where you'll find written reviews of plenty more sci-fi classics in both film and literature. Until next time, though, when people from the future will start messing with plane crashes, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anybody.